Welcome to Rev'd Up for Sunday, a lectionary podcast from the clergy of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut. I'm John Kennedy.
And I'm Peter Walsh.
I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
And we are in Jesus' parable era, according to the Gospel of Mark. This is the Gospel text for June 16th, that is proper 6, or the fourth Sunday after Pentecost. Let's hear the text. And it is Mark chapter 4, verses 26 through 34. Jesus also said, "The kingdom of God is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground, and would sleep and rise night and day, and the seed would sprout and grow. He does not know how. The earth produces of itself, first the stalk, then the head, then the full grain in the head. But when the grain is ripe, at once he goes in with his sickle, because the harvest has come." He also said, "With what can we compare the kingdom of God? Or what parable will we use for it? It is like a mustard seed, which when sown upon the ground is the smallest of all the seeds on earth. Yet when it is sown, it grows up and becomes the greatest of all shrubs, and puts forth large branches, so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade." With many such parables, he spoke the word to them, as they were able to hear it. He did not speak to them except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his disciples. Okay, where do we begin?
Thanks. I'm going to start very high level, just to sort of to orient us just a little bit here. We finished last time. We were with Jesus' family in Beelzebul and a Markan sandwich, and now we are at the end of chapter 4, having skipped the beginnings of this. And as we are wrestling with the text, I think it's important for everybody to remember that which I know that we keep in mind, but the whole of the gospel comes from material that the evangelists have, and then they form it to the messages of their time. So we have parables that Jesus spoke. That we have the same parables are handed down into the early church, and then the evangelists get a hold of the parables and move them around to their own ends, and then we in stage 4 get these parables and try to make some sense out of them too. So we get what goes back to the original stuff that Jesus spoke about. Scholars spend a tremendous amount of time on, and parable as gospel in Mark's gospel, as you pointed out. I mean, we're rolling along very quickly in Mark's gospel, immediately. Then we hit chapter 4 and we go bambo, chapter 4 parables, and that whole thing is set up with these kind of concentric teachings, or concentric way it's put together, where you can see Mark is a very, very skilled writer. And in Mark's gospel, there's actually only 6 parables, which I find shocking. There's a lot of
I'm always surprised by that.
Parabolic sayings, but here we get right to the end of the chapter and we get the 2 sayings on the kingdom of God. So just to give us some sense about how we begin to put on glasses to look at these 2 small parables, which are, have abundant meaning, mustard bush meaning.
And it does help to read these in the context of Mark itself, and realize that when it's written, the people are living in a hostile world, and they're living in a kind of urgency of fear for their lives, living in a lot of secrecy. And I think the imagery in this gospel always alludes, always kind of connects with that emotion or that life experience of being in hiding, needing to be hopeful in the face of, apparent hopelessness. And so these parables all have a touch of that, and especially this idea that the kingdom of God is as if someone would scatter a seed on the ground. They can't know how this movement is possibly going to turn out right for them. They're being persecuted, and they're hopeful, but they clearly need this kind of teaching that, no matter what they can't do or can't control, it's going to grow and flourish. And I think this first part is about the certainty of growth and that one day there will be something to harvest.
Yeah, I think that you're right on about that, because really the bizarre good news in some sense is that the apparent failure that they're in amidst of and the apparent complete insignificance is not the last word.
Yeah.
That's the good news for them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that Mark is most traditionally associated with Rome. Obviously, it's most traditionally associated with the person of Mark, which scholars are now not so sure about. But I believe the Roman setting is at least as good of a bet as anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And given that that's the center of the empire that is, of course, very much opposed to this movement. And this is an empire that is, not yet on the decline. Of course, it will be. I mean, maybe it is in some ways, but it wasn't obvious. The imperial power was still very, very strong. And who were these, kind of nobodies to stand a chance in the face of an emperor and an army that was set against them. So I think that context is very, very useful here. And of course, persecution is a major theme as Mark continues. And indeed, by this point in the story, Jesus is already facing quite a bit of opposition, not from the Roman Empire yet, but from his own people, from the authorities, from the establishment, whatever, of his own tradition and of his own people. So division is already in the water. Last week, Jesus was accused by Jewish religious authorities of being the devil, basically, or in league with the devil. So all that's in the mix here. I think this chapter is so interesting in Mark's narrative because from the very beginning of Mark's gospel, Jesus is proclaiming the kingdom of God. Yet, it is only here that he really says anything about what that means. It's not the most obvious imagery. It's agrarian imagery, farming. It is humble imagery. It is small. It is earthy. It involves darkness, obscurity, not really knowing what's happening or how it's happening or at what rate it's going to happen. But I see the mustard seed as the parable as sort of, at least as much as anything else, the heart of this passage. And you have a small seed, Jesus says the smallest of seeds, that becomes the greatest of shrubs, or sometimes translated trees. This is interesting Old Testament echoes, which are echoing passages about trees, so I think trees is legitimate either way. The greatest something that will provide shelter for the creatures of the earth, sustenance and shelter for the creatures of the earth. So there is this very hopeful image coming from obscurity, which Jesus, I think, so helpfully borrows from the earth, from the workings of the earth. And one interesting note I saw here before shutting up for a moment is that, this setting, Jesus is in a boat here, right? If I understand, he's gotten into a boat to give these teachings.
Oh, yeah, maybe the crowds are pressing on him and he gets
right.
into the boat. Yeah, because the next scene is the stilling of the storm.
Right.
Where they sail
Either
out.
way, it's coastal, water setting. And yet the imagery he's using here is imagery of farming, and so this likely is Jesus borrowing on his own upbringing not in Galilee, well, yes, but in Nazareth. Which is
interesting. So I was going to be quiet, but I'll have to step in on that one.
Yeah, go for it.
So no, I would say that would not be true. That the Galilee is the breadbasket of the whole area then and now. And so if you're on the water's edge in the boat in the so-called Sea of Galilee, which is really a lake, that all around it is the verdant green hills. And so, this is, as you know, Jesus lived in Palestine. He didn't live in Israel. He lived in Palestine, and that was a green Palestine. And those lands, which are now in the state of Israel, are still green lands. So, but you do get that incredible imagery that has to do with farming, and then you were talking about it being in Rome. So this is an example of the layering of meanings through time.
Well, they were exiled to Rome by this point, if we're talking about the Markan community. But in the story of the gospel, Jesus is speaking the language of the people and his own self, and they all can understand what it's like to plant seeds and what it's like to cultivate mustard plants, and they know this stuff. And I don't think Jesus is trying to be obscure. He's just likening the kingdom of God to these phenomenon in nature that, the use of a shrub. It's interesting to me. Jesus is sort of ironic because he's just been talking about kingdoms divided against themselves, and he's maybe conveying that the kingdom of God, it's a third way. It doesn't have to look like a huge tree, the giant empire. It's not the goal. The goal is to provide nesting for all the birds of the air and every kind of winged creature, and large branches, and also the fact that it comes from nearly nothing, something almost invisible and so obscure. And he's not just drawing from what they see around them. He's drawing from his tradition. There's the Old Testament is filled with images of trees likened to empires falling and rising, and how those empires provide branches, and for same metaphor, the birds of the air. It's in Judges, it's in Ezekiel, it's in Daniel. It's always the phrases, all the birds of the air made nests in its boughs, from Ezekiel. And even on Ezekiel warning the Pharaoh about his fall, that the fallen trunk of Assyria, even on the fallen trunk settled all the birds of the air. There's a lot of irony and stuff in these metaphors, but it's a very, very familiar image for them. Yes. So Jesus is using that, and they're also always associated with the rise and fall of kingdoms and empires. So I don't think it's any mistake here that this is the imagery Jesus uses for the kingdom of God.
No, not at all. And I think you were touching on something that I wrote down verbatim because it reminded me of you and what I was reading this morning from a great book that I really didn't like at all in seminary. I thought it was the drollest, most boring book of all time, and now I just think it's fantastic. It's called The Gospel in Parable by John Donahue. I don't know if it's even still in print. If it is, I suggest anybody really into this is a great text. And it says here, the Markan version, along with its allegorical overtones, which you were just laying out for us, both of you were laying out, contains a comic twist, which you noted is ironic, which is true. The place where the birds, i.e. nations, will gather is not a mighty tree, but the greatest of all shrubs, a subtle hint that God's kingdom is not like the mighty trees, i.e. empires of old, which are established through and now Elizabeth Garnsey, power and violence, right? And so it's
not my original thoughts.
No, but that which is so real to you in your heart of hearts. And so to say that yes, it draws on all that, and then it ironically twists it.
Yeah, and that interplay of drawing on this Old Testament language and imagery, and twisting it, and where it's twisting it and where it's in continuity with it, is a very interesting question for me. And I think this passage kind of, for me, forces that question, because another Old Testament reference is in verse 29 in the first parable Jesus tells here of the growing seed. He says, when the grain is ripe, at once he goes in with his sickle because the harvest has come. And in Joel chapter 3, it says, put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. And it goes on. And this is a passage that's also, not the same passage, but it's from the same general part of Joel that's quoted in Acts on the day of Pentecost about the pouring out of the Spirit. This is really the coming day of the Lord, this eschatological moment that the people of Jesus' tradition, of course, the Jewish people at his time, were looking forward to. They felt like it was coming. They felt like it was imminent, at least many of them do. There was so much expectation, which is basically why there were so many messianic movements during Jesus' time, right? We've talked about how his wasn't the only one. His was like the only one that worked in a way. It worked in a very unexpected way, which goes very much with these parables, but it was the only one that worked ultimately. And, this time in Joel is described as when after some devastation, after some serious hardship faced by God's people, detailed in various ways throughout the whole of the scriptures. God will in some way restore God's people. The Spirit will be poured out, which is what we get again in Acts. And then there will be some sort of judgment commonly understood by, again, Jesus' people, the people of his day, as a judgment in favor of Israel, that is the people of God, and against the world, against the nations. And Jesus is, I think, in so many ways, not just in these passages, but saying that, as I understand it, of course, as many commentators do, that time is coming, and that time is coming through Jesus, but it's not going to look like what anybody expects. It's not simply a matter of, yay, Israel, obviously, that's very politically loaded right now, but we're just talking about ancient Israel, and boo on the rest of the world. It's a much more complicated matter in which the people of God, the people who think of themselves as the people of God, shouldn't be so sure about where they stand. The first will be last and the last will be first, and all that sort of inverting upside down kingdom language that we get throughout. So just that to say that I think that Jesus is in keeping with these traditional ideas about the kingdom coming, and the kingdom not, even though it starts obscure and starts sort of powerless and weak, not always remaining so, growing into something truly great and mighty, but still not looking like worldly ideas of power and might and so on. So I find that very interesting, and I'm certainly interested in what you two might have to say about that.
Wow, yeah, thanks for all that. That was a big lesson in sweeping understanding of this gospel. I mean, judgment in Israel and kingdoms. It's
just rambling.
No, not at all. But I'm trying to take in everything you just said, because I guess when Jesus is talking about the kingdom, in the history of the church, it did, in many eras, and maybe too many eras, play out as, the alternative empire. And, the Constantinian church took hold, and it just mirrored, every empire around it with wealth and power and accumulation and domination and murdering people who wouldn't submit to baptism and all that stuff. Taking judgment into our own hands as a church was a big theme of the first millennia, for sure, in many parts of that era. But, I think that's part of what Jesus is saying here, is that when it's the kingdom of God, is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground, there's nothing we have to do with the growth of the seed. The earth produces of itself. So we are really not at all in control of the emergence of the kingdom. We just have to scatter the seeds and then rise night and day and rest in hope. Wendell Berry, the great agrarian in Kentucky, has one of my favorite poems of his, is very short, and he just says, the seed is in the ground. Now let us rest in hope while darkness does its work.
Wow.
Beautiful.
Wow.
I think that's really the posture of the disciples, or that what we as disciples are meant to take on, is just in spite of a warring, violent, divided world, where there's so much inequality and so much poverty and so much disease and so much upside down values and competing, notions of who's in charge or should be in charge. We have to just keep sowing the seeds of love. There's just no other way the kingdom will come about except by scattering those seeds on a hostile ground, and by some miracle, God grows these tiny, obscure, invisible seeds into something great. And we experience that, in our corners. I think the gospel's always taking place in the shadows, in the corners.
The part interesting, the part that resonates the least with me is the end time stuff, the sickle and the harvest, I find the least interesting piece of it. And not to say all that this conversation isn't edifying, and I'm listening, but I think that for the small parable we get a proliferation of possible things that it might say. And for me, the more interesting, just how it resonates with me, the more interesting things that the way Jesus describes it, it basically says that all is gift and grace, and that there is a mystery of growth, a mystery of hidden growth, that I know in 19th century the big deal was that at least the liberal portion of the church said that God is mysteriously working in human hearts and in society. That's one could argue that now in the century we live in, but I think that what I think is interesting is this is a commentary on the church that we're a part of. I think, and it says, for instance, the kingdom of God is divine work, and I sometimes think we're very active in a church that is so active that we think that it's our job to bring the kingdom of God into the world, which is not what the parable says exactly, and that the kingdom, the divine dimension, has its own energy. In fact, it uses the word automate. I mean, where we get automated from, the earth has its own energy here, and that gradual growth is what's happening here. This isn't, and in Jesus' day, it would have been considered that this was going to happen in a kind of, it would be wrong to use the term explosive, but it would come in, like boom, like a wild inbreaking. And what this is describing is a much more ordinary, patient undertaking in which we rise. You notice the way they do the timing there. We get the Hebrew understanding of a day, which starts at night.
Right.
It's all it's inverted by our language, but it's the Hebrew understanding. So I think that what this is talking about is the kingdom is the inbreaking of God's presence, which is what these things are really about. The inbreaking of God's presence isn't like a wombo, and it doesn't land like that. The inbreaking of God's presence is already in our midst, and it rises with these rhythms like this.
Yeah.
And it's hidden in our dailiness.
Mm-hmm.
I also really love the image of the branches, places for shelter and shade and nesting and protection. And, that a kingdom of God kind of way is something that invites and gathers and allows people to move in, live together in harmony. I mean, it's a very teleological, kind of like aspirational image.
Everybody belongs in the
everybody
tree.
Belongs. And it's just so kumbaya to talk like that. But I do think the images, like you're saying, that Jesus draws upon are almost subtly different, because there's never any kind of bludgeoning or, kapow sort of entry. You're right. Yeah. I agree with that.
Yeah. Before we wrap it up, let's just say, a word about the mustard seed. The smallest becomes the largest.
So, I mentioned this before we started recording, but I read this little passage by John Chrysostom, one of the church fathers, and he says that basically that the mustard seed is Jesus, which I was like, well, obviously, and yet that wasn't actually where my head was during my earlier study and reflection on this passage. But what else? What better sums up this idea or embodies this idea of something that is ultimately so great and so mighty and expansive and all the superlative language we could use, and yet at the same time, or at least in its beginnings, so small and so humble. And it's like, Jesus, like the word, the seed through whom the world grew out of, right? The theological idea largely coming from John's gospel, that the world was made by God through the word, logos, which is Jesus, that Jesus is the seed from which the world grows, and then in the incarnation, this word becomes this like little humble person who is put on a cross, and that is really his planting, right? His being planted in the ground, and from that grows the kingdom, right? Jesus is the kingdom of God. Jesus is the mustard seed. And I found that very profound. And for me, that just challenges all notions of what one can expect from God. And because in so many ways, I think the gradualness that you've both given voice to is true, and it's obviously you're both riffing on the language of this passage. But then there's like the resurrection, which is like a kapow moment. So for me, it just is a call to just like you've said, kind of trust that this is divine work, and wait. But yeah, I really like that interpretation of the mustard seed. I don't always like John Chrysostom, but I like that. So I offered that.
Yeah, that's good. It's reminding me of that passage in John where Jesus says, unless the grain falls to the ground and dies, it remained a single grain. I think this imagery is in every single one of the Gospels, and that really resonates what you said with me.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, hopefully this has planted some seeds with you. I know that was really low-hanging fruit there, so I had to go for it. Okay. And please like, comment, and subscribe. Are we still advertising the Worm Line?
We are.
Sorry, I've been away for a couple weeks. So give us a call, leave us a voicemail. We truly do love to hear from you. Obviously, just drop a comment in the YouTube box as well if you prefer to communicate with us that way. And we will see you next time. Peace.